Hi, my name is Kristen Lees, and this is my trauma summary for week 7. My hypothetical client is not really hypothetical. It's somebody that I deal with on a daily basis in my employment as a child protection worker. It's a foster parent. And more often than not, I encounter foster parents who want to adopt. They get into fostering specifically to adopt. They open their homes to these children who have experienced sometimes unspeakable traumas because they just want to care for them and love them and show them that there's a different way in life. Um, but our foster families go through a lot of training, but in that training, it doesn't always explain what our children go through. I think sometimes people get into fostering through child protection and they think they're going to get a cookie cutter kid, no blemishes on the record, and they'll live a happy, long, and healthy life, which is, of course, our goal, but they don't understand that sometimes the children that they're taking on, especially if they're a little bit older, are coming with a book that's somewhat already written. So I try to have the conversations with my foster parents, and I try to explain to them what the trauma is, how it's affecting them now, why it's affecting them now, and if interventions and services aren't put into place, how can it affect them long term? So I'm going to have the conversation with you as if I was talking to one of my foster parents. And I hope that I do the subject of trauma justice. So first I want to explain what an adverse childhood experience is, or something that we call an ACE. Now, we don't do an ACE score or anything like that, but most of the children who come into care have experienced adverse childhoods events in their life. We already know if they're in care that they've had one experience, which is a removal from the home. Unless they're an infant, they know what's going on. Even at 1 years old, they have that separation. They feel that separation. They know their mom or whoever their caretaker was when they're 1 year old, and you're taking them from that. That in itself is a trauma. But there's things that led up to the removal. And it could have been a one-time traumatic event. It could have been acute, unexpected. For instance, a mom is driving with her kid in the backseat and mom gets a DWI. And the kid has no idea what's going on, and all of a sudden he's in foster care. Or it could be complex. It could be repetitive. It could be that there's no freedom from it. And when we're talking about that kind of trauma, we're normally talking about abuse, whether it be physical, emotional, sexual, or we could be talking about neglect, physical or emotional. It's when there's no let up, there's no relief from the trauma. It's daily for that child. It's day in and day out. It's what they've known. Other childhood adverse experience, other ACEs that children could experience, it could be divorce, separation from a parent, substance abuse in the home, and a lot of the time our children have that as well. A lot of the time our children, our babies in care, are born addicted. Mental illness in the home. There's a lot of things that could create what we call a trauma response in this child's life. When I think of a child, or when I think of anybody's life, I don't think of it as distorted stages that are molded together. Each stage of someone's life, and in this instance a child's life, each stage is built off of its predecessor. So what happens in one stage of this child's life influences the next stage of their life, and so on. So if you're looking at it that way and you have a trauma and they're experiencing this trauma and it's not addressed, it's not cared for, they're not rescued from it, there's no services put in place, there's no interventions, that toxic trauma is going to affect each stage of that child's life. When you think of stress, no, let's start over. Stress is normal to an extent. One could even argue that it's kind of necessary for development. It helps you learn a little bit of resilience. It kind of sparks that fight or flight response. You kind of have to problem solve to get out of what that stress is, what's causing that stress. Stress in itself is not a horrendous thing. Stress becomes toxic when it's frequent, when it's prolonged, when there's no release, and the brain is constantly in this stress response. When the brain is constantly having to acknowledge the stress response, that's when it becomes toxic. And that's when it affects a child's brain development. And that can have lifelong implications for a child if it's not addressed. Not only emotionally, behaviorally, socially, and all of that can critically affect a child's overall functioning as an adult. How we perceive relationships when we're children affects how we perceive relationships when we're adults. We go off of learned behaviors. We go off of what's known to us. We go off of modeling. So if we have a kid who's been affected by trauma and there are no services or interventions put into place, and that child is just kind of left out there to fend on their own, their brain is not developing in a healthy manner. They're having what's called a trauma-informed brain. And that's going to affect their overall life functioning. I kind of call it a checkup from the head up, or a checkup from the neck up. A lot of people will address children and say, "What's wrong with you?" That's not the right conversation to be having. We have to speak with children and we have to say, "What happened to you? How can I help you?" It's important and it's necessary to get interventions into place when they are children, when they are at this ripe age, because these things can be corrected. With the proper services and interventions, Johnny, Mark, Susie, Sally, they don't have to have constant issues with behaviors. They don't have to have constant emotional outbursts. They don't know how to communicate what they've been through. They don't know how to not be highly stressed. They don't know what it's like to think from a place that's not stressed. They don't know how to think from a place that is not anxiety, and they don't even know what anxiety is. They just know their stomach always hurts, or they always have a headache. It's our responsibility as a caseworker, as a foster parent, to guide them through these stages and through this trauma, and to ensure that they can process the trauma in a healthy, effective way so that it just becomes a bump in the road. It becomes a part of who they are, but it doesn't dictate who they are. And that's what our kids need to understand, that there is hope, happiness, healthiness, loving and caring families on the other side of this. And just because they've had this trauma, it does not mean they are written off. It does not mean they don't have a chance. And it does not mean it has to dictate who they are. Just because their mother had a substance abuse issue, it does not mean that they're going to have that issue. But it's important to meet them where they are and to put the services into place to help them process the trauma effectively and in a safe environment, so they are not constantly always coming from a place that's high stress or that's toxic. The other aspect that I like to hit on is protective factors. I was involved in this program. I wasn't involved in the program that I helped create it, but I took part in a training called Sources of Strength through Dr. Robert Macy with the Trauma Network. One thing I like to say is trauma and protective factors can equal resilience. And protective factors can be trusted adults in the school, trusted adults in the home, peers, community supports, religious supports. So this doesn't have to dictate their future. And I think it's really important that we start having the conversation of what happened to you, how can I help you, instead of encountering these children who are acting out, driving you a little bit nuts, starting fights, and all you want to say is, what is wrong with you? The other thing that I point out to foster parents when I have these conversations with them is we don't just have to worry about Johnny who's fighting all the time, but we've got to worry about the Johnny who's quiet. A lot of the kids who are acting out in classrooms, in homes, are the ones that are getting the most attention. But we've also got to be watchful and careful of those withdrawn children, the children that are going with the flow, the children that are very easygoing and don't cause any trouble. They've been through something too. Now, granted, it doesn't affect everybody the same way. They could be from the same exact situation and they could be feeling it in completely different ways. But always check in. And just because they're quiet, not causing any fights, doesn't mean that there's not an internal battle going on with them. And I kind of wrap it up by saying I know this was a very serious and heavy conversation, but what I want you to take from it is that this is not a life sentence for them. I have seen children who have gone through horrific traumas do very, very well with support. And they need that support from you, from me, from the school. And they've got to see that there's adults out there that they can trust. So, okay, so that's my video. That's my conversation, kind of long and disjointed maybe. But recording yourself can be a little bit weird. I like to think that in real life it flows a little bit better and I sound a little like at least I know what I'm talking about. And I'm looking forward to any comments that you may have. Thanks.